Hey friends, thank you so much for tuning in. In today's episode, I'm going to be talking with Brian Kateman, who is a co-founder and the president of the Reducetarian Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to reducing consumption of meat, eggs, and dairy to create a healthy, sustainable, and compassionate world. He is the author of Meet Me Halfway, inspired by a documentary of the same name, and the editor of the Reducetarian Cookbook and the Reducetarian Solution. He's also an adjunct professor of environmental science and sustainability at Keene University and teaches environmental communications at Fordham. I deeply admire Brian's efforts, and I'm confident that you will too. I understand that you grew up in a meat-heavy household in Staten Island, surrounded by an abundance of Italian food.
Yeah, you're right. I grew up in a very meat-heavy household. I would eat Burger King, McDonald's, Popeyes, KFC, these kinds of foods all the time, and certainly some pizza and meatballs to align with the very much Italian heritage that exists through much of Staten Island. I always liked nature, even as a kid, and I cared a lot about the animals that were living in those wild spaces, and I just sort of cared about ethics and trying to live um, a life that didn't create as much suffering. And at some point, I made the connection to food. In college, I read a book called The Ethics of What We Eat by Peter Singer and Jim Mason. And I was just shocked to learn how it is that we raise animals for food, that it's one of the major drivers of biodiversity loss and many other environmental issues. Of course, there's animal cruelty involved, and it's not healthy for people to consume so many animal products, especially those from factory farms, which is where most animal products come from. And so I did the sensible thing. I decided I was going to be vegetarian, sort of on my way to being vegan. And that was challenging because I didn't eat vegetables or fruits or really whole grains or legumes or really any whole plant-based foods. I was primarily eating fast food, pizza, and so on. So, I had a lot of pasta when I first started, and step by step added more plant-based ingredients that were not just the kind of, rigatoni to my diet. Um, but, I wasn't perfect about it. There were social situations where I found myself occasionally eating animal products, and omnivores gave me flack for it, for kind of trying to seem like I was doing something good, but I was just an omnivore from their perspective. And vegans would sometimes give me flack for not being perfect about it and not upholding that value. And I also realized that everyone around me thought I was really strange for trying to be as plant based as possible. They had no intention of doing that. But I noticed they could be convinced to cut back on animal products. They might be willing to participate in something like Meatless Monday, or to just try to have a plant based meal a day or something like that. And so I realized there was really a need for a communications campaign, a movement that was centered around not necessarily veganism or vegetarianism, though cutting back on animal products will certainly lead some people down that path, but simply encouraging people to try to eat more plant-based foods. And I've been doing this for almost 10 years, not just the work, but the diet, and I feel great. I feel great on the diet. I don't feel great about the state of the world and how many animal products are eaten. But I'd say the more I've been doing this, the more hardcore I've become, in a sense. Uh, I don't crave meat the way I used to. I feel comfortable eating a plant-based diet. But I understand for the average person that even asking them to cut back 10% or 15% would seem intimidating. But it's, in my opinion, from an ask perspective, it's one of the best ones we could deploy. So that's my story and kind of how the reduced movement got started.
How did this transition from standard meat eater to reducetarian to plant-based affect you and your immediate community?
It's a good question. I mean, certainly I felt great eating healthier. I think when you stop eating so much unhealthy food, you feel lighter, you feel like you have more energy. My acne seriously cleared up. I look back at my years of, challenges with that, and I probably should have just cut back on all those fried foods, mostly animal products, and would have been happier. Um, it does have an impact on your community, though. Some positive, some negative. I think it was challenging for some of my family. I remember coming home to eat at my my parents' house, and my mom would say, I made a stew with meat in it, and I said, Mom, like I'm trying to eat plant based, and she's like, oh, I don't know, all the time, like you can't just have. And so it gets confusing to people, especially when I'm the one saying it's not all or nothing. But there's a kind of commitment to try to do the best that I can, even though I'm flawed. And I think it was challenging for some of my friends when we'd have to pick a restaurant, we'd have to go to a place that had at least one vegan option. So I think the hardest part for many people, if you look at surveys, the hardest part is the community and finding community. Luckily, 10 years have passed and things have gotten much easier. It's gotten a lot easier to eat more plant-based foods. It's still challenging in some respects, but it's gotten easier. And I think people are just they're just used to me, and they're used to my interest in this. And I've seen a lot of friends come along the path, not necessarily be plant-based, but be excited about eating more plant-based food. And I've also seen the results of the work that my organization have been doing, the Reducetarian Foundation, and millions of people have in one way or another encountered our messaging, and some of them have expressed a commitment to cutting back on animal products. And though we need billions of people to do that, I'm happy to have played and to continue to play a small role in trying to move away from factory farming.
I can relate to that. A lot of my friends and family initially were hesitant or confused or upset at times because of my new lifestyle. I grew up eating fast food, lots of Italian food, and also respected nature and animals when I was a kid. As time passed, something beautiful happened. Not only did they adjust to the change, but many of them also embarked on their own journeys, gradually embracing more plant based food and often asking me for recommendations. I also feel great about not eating animals anymore. After I stopped, I felt lighter in two ways. Both like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders, knowing I no longer was paying someone to do horrible things to animals that I would never do myself, but also I felt physically lighter, and my stomach and body didn't feel so worn down and heavy after eating a big meal. Non vegans can sometimes be a bit confused by the different labels and descriptions of vegans and vegan friendly diets. How would you describe the difference between veganism and reducitarianism? Is there a difference between reducitarianism and flexitarianism?
Yeah, there's a lot of fun with thinking about these different terms. Part of the challenge is they mean different things to different people. So I can share what those words mean to me and what I think we should think of these words to mean. A reducitarian is anyone who has decided to cut back on the amount of animal products that they consume. So that's red meat, poultry, seafood, eggs, dairy, maybe honey, maybe leather, other products that we might consume in one way or another that come from factory farms. Vegans and vegetarians are reducitarians. They are people who have decided to cut back on animal products. So it's just that they've done so effectively that in the case of vegans, they eat none at all, and vegetarians have cut out meat, and certainly have many have cut back on the amounts of eggs and dairy that they consume. I'll give you a bonus. A flexitarian is someone who primarily eats plant-based foods, but occasionally includes animal products in their diet. Plant-based, for me, has the connotation of someone who almost always eats plant-based foods, but doesn't worry so much about the occasional inclusion of animal products. It's like vegan light. Okay, I don't know what's in this cookie. It's not that big of a deal. Or, someone has an M&M left and they're going to throw it out. I'm going to eat the M&M. It's just a kind of chiller attitude about not sweating the small stuff. And I sweat lots of small stuff in life, but that's not one of them. I'm very happy eating 99.9% plant based. And I'm sure I'm not perfect, but I do the best I can. And I really like that attitude in general about life. I'm not a perfect son. I should call my parents more. I'm not a perfect dad. I could be ever more focused. I could walk my dogs more. There are so many things that I do in a day that are not up to what I would consider to be a moral standard. And I think that's just part of being human. And I think it's very important for us to acknowledge that we are flawed and we're really trying to do the best we can. And for me, words like reducitarian or plant-based, those signal that value, and that value is, I think, very important for creating a world that is more compassionate and filled with less suffering. But critically, I'll just finish by saying reducetarian is an umbrella term. So it includes all of these terms: the vegans, the vegetarians, the flexitarians, the plant-based, so on. It's by design. It's meant to emphasize our commonality, what we share. We don't want to be like the people who, in the United States, for example, who on average eat 250 pounds of meat a year. We want to be different. For some, that'll be eating 220 pounds of meat a year, or 200 pounds. For others, that'll be eating 5 pounds, and for others, it'll be eating 0. But I think it's important that we recognize that we're doing better than the vast majority of people, and I want to celebrate that. To this day, I really feel happy when I eat a plant-based meal, because I feel like that's a time in my day I'm doing something good for me and for the world. And I want to celebrate that. I want to celebrate every single plant-based food that we consume. And I don't want us to focus so much on our failures, because there's a lot of failures in a day. And I think by focusing on our successes, we're more likely to increase the number of successes that we have.
Well, I love your humility and your ability to admit flaws. Not everybody, but many people are on this quest to be perfect, and perfection is unfortunately out of all of our grasps. So I do appreciate that. Now, would you say that the reduce in reducetarian is applicable only to the amount of animals you consume, or about the harm that you're reducing?
That's a very good and very tough question. Technically, reducetarian is about cutting back on animal products. So you think of the word vegetarian or flexitarian, or there's a root there, and it's really about cutting back on animal products. So it's not about cutting back on plastic bottles. It's not about cutting back on other sources of environmental damage or so on. And part of the reason for that is because, from my perspective, factory farming is one of the worst. There's really no industry that causes as much harm, in every sense of the word, to our shared existence, which dovetails nicely to your second question. I am concerned about reducing suffering. That is, if I had to describe one of my main mission in life, it would be to reduce suffering. For me, reducetarianism is about reducing animal products, but the consequence of that is my ultimate goal, which is reducing harm and reducing suffering. So that's part of the reason why I sometimes focus on issues that are outside of just cutting back on animal products. I see suffering everywhere I go. I see suffering that I cause everywhere I go. So I think for some advocates, they're only focused on this one area of harm that exists, factory farming. And I would argue no industry creates as much suffering as factory farming. So if someone had to be focused on one, that's a good place to be. But it is important to me to recognize, and I think it's important for all of us to recognize, that there are many forms of suffering. And if really our goal at the end of the day is to reduce suffering, either now or in the future, we're going to need to look well beyond the suffering that exists in factory farms. So that's a complicated answer, but you have arrived at my core truth and existence through that inquiry. So I appreciate it.
What are some of those areas of suffering outside of factory farming and animal agriculture that would be of greatest concern to you?
The one that keeps me up at night is wild animal suffering. I'm very concerned about the trillions and trillions of animals that exist in the wild. Many of them are currently being eaten alive right now. Many are starving. Many are thirsty, on the brink of death. Many are terrified. Many are freezing. Some are sweltering. And that to me is very upsetting. Uh, and it's on a scale that makes factory farming look minor in terms of the amount of suffering that is generated from wild animals in nature. So I just went for a walk earlier today, and I was thinking about how many animals I probably either hurt or killed beneath my feet, and whether those animals are better off alive or dead, whether my act was mercy or cruelty. And now this might seem strange, it might seem myopic, it might seem like a distraction. I don't think it is. I think the act of thinking about all of our actions and ways that we can be compassionate and reduce suffering is important. And one way I do that is by eating plant based food. But there are many, many different ways that we can think about our actions. What's nice about factory farming, if you can ever say that phrase, is that we know it's incredibly cruel and awful, and we know how to stop it. In a sense, we could all just significantly cut back on animal products, and we have all these different tools at our disposal to try to make it easier for folks to do that. But there are lots of other problems that are more challenging, and I think wild animals suffering. What should we do about that? I have absolutely no idea. I don't know. There are people that are trying to conduct research to figure it out. There are even stranger ideas. I'm very concerned about us colonizing other planets. I don't like the idea that we're going to have factory farming on Mars, or that we're going to um, raise animals for all sorts of reasons. For example, there's some evidence to suggest that we could factory farm insects for materials that we could use for creating infrastructure on other planets. I think someone should try to slow the progress of space colonization. I don't like the idea of humanity going other places. So yeah, there's lots of ways that we cause suffering, and there's lots of ways that we could and possibly will, or even probably will, cause lots of suffering in the future. So um, what's important to me is that someone pick a focus and try to do something about it. But there's many opportunities in the world to try to reduce suffering. Factory farming is certainly one of them, but there are many.
I too care about wild animal suffering, though the ways to tackle those issues are far too complex to address effectively right now. Factory farming to me, however, is the paramount in which we as individuals can each reduce massive amounts of suffering. I agree with you, Brian. We need to look at all suffering in all of its forms and see what we can each do to mitigate that suffering. Can you share any examples of pushback you've received and how you've responded to the criticism?
Yeah, it's really hard to end factory farming, and it's really hard to reduce societal consumption of animal products, and it's certainly really hard to create a vegan world. So that invites questions around what is the most effective strategy for doing that. And even more fundamentally, what is the right way to do that, right in some moral sense? I'm an unapologetic consequentialist. I care about results. I'm an unapologetic utilitarian. I think that more happiness is good, more suffering is bad. Those are the things that I care about at the end of the day. So I'm looking through that lens, and that might already invite some critiques. Uh, for example, some might think that even if the results of some action are good, it could be or would be wrong to violate someone's rights. For example, so even if an ant would be happier if I were to step on her, I shouldn't. I shouldn't step on that ant, and I don't see it like that. And I won't see it like that when my dog one day is very old and the saddest day of my life, one of my saddest days, and 15 years old, let's say, and I have to make a decision around whether to take my dog to the vet or not to put my dog down. So I think there are lots of complicated examples where one might argue, we are potentially violating rights. That's not something that I necessarily am focused on. I'm concerned about suffering. So that's already a core split, I think, in many parts of the movement. This has expressed itself in lots of different ways. Angry emails, angry comments, angry tweets, disruptions of places where I've spoken at, including at a well-known animal rights conference in the United States. Um, the truth, though, which maybe is less interesting, but I guess is more relaxing, is throughout the past 10 years, that negative feedback has significantly declined. Like when I first started, it was every day, it was extremely stressful. And I was also new to the movement. I remember my wife being like scared, like for my safety and sanity. Um, I don't really get that much pushback anymore. I know people disagree, but things are much calmer. They're more respectful. Um, I actually don't know why that is. I don't know it's because people have accepted me and Reducetarian and that this is not going away. I don't know if it's that the movement has shifted. They have decided that they want to focus more on evidence based kinds of advocacy. Um, but these are some of the reasons I think why that the Reducetarian campaign has been upsetting to some folks. And I think for me, I'm just interested in making the world a better place. And I think that at the most honest, we need different messages. We need some people who are pushing veganism and somebody pushing, kind of a cut back on animal products kind of message. But I will say, from what I can tell, all of the evidence suggests, or certainly most of the evidence suggests, that if you're trying to get someone to cut back on animal products or be vegan, from what I can tell, telling them to cut back on animal products is the better way to go. There are many, many different studies that show this. And then philosophically, um, I just want the world to be less bad. So I'm not interested in creating a good world. That's not how I think about things. Right now, the world is like, from 0 to 100, 100 being a utopia, 0 being hell on earth. We're like at 1. So if tomorrow or 10 years from now it were a 2, that would be a success to me. And then after that, I'd go for 3, and then 4 and 5. And I'm just not interested in utopias. And I also think utopias, quite frankly, are harmful. I think there are a lot of people who are motivated to do some of the things that I've critiqued, like colonize other planets or generate AI. Kind of under the guise that we can have a great universe where everyone is happy all the time. I don't think that's the case. I think there's something inherent in humans that will always cause lots of problems, not just for each other, but to other species. And I don't want to even project the idea into the world that it's possible to have a utopia. If we get to a place where it's a 99, so now there's like, I don't know, a million animals being slaughtered for food instead of 70 billion each year, and they're all on grass and they're all seem to be happy. I'm then very open to having the debate around whether we should try to end that system. But right now, I don't think I'm going to be alive when that world exists. So I'm not really concerned about the 99 out of 100. Let's talk about that once we're not living hell on earth. Then I'd be happy to have that conversation. That's where I fall on that issue.
I love your extreme honesty and I like your extreme pragmatism. It's very interesting and it's bringing up a lot of ideas that I think a lot of people don't think about. I face criticism too. Some vegans find me too extreme, some vegans find me not extreme enough. It's essential to recognize that you essentially can't please everyone. Not everyone in our movement shares this kind of pragmatism.
Thanks, hi John. I really appreciate that.
You're welcome. So, what challenges do reducitarians face and how can they address these? Are there pros and cons to being a reducitarian?
Yeah, I think about this on both an individual and systemic level. So, as an individual, cutting back on animal products is one of the best decisions a person can make in terms of improving their health, in terms of improving the state of the planet, reducing animal suffering, fighting food justice issues, so on. So there's many reasons to celebrate this, both some selfish and some altruistic, which is a great combination. It's also really fun to try new foods. I had never had Indian food until I met my wife. I never had Thai food. I had never. I don't honestly know if I'd ever had a salad. I honestly don't know. It's possible I never did. Uh, yeah, and so there's so many ways that cutting back on animal products can feel restrictive in a sense because you want that food that's bad for you and bad for the world, but you resist. There's a sense of resistance that can come, and that can be challenging. But there's also a wonder and beauty to the idea of expanding what it is that you normally eat and eating more plant based foods. I also definitely have saved money by significantly cutting back on animal products because they tend to be much more expensive, especially if you're eating, certain whole plant-based foods like beans or quinoa or rice and so on. So I think there are plenty of benefits. I also feel great joy in living a purposeful life. It's challenging to care about an issue, but it's also nice to feel like you're playing, hopefully, a small part in making the world a better place. Um, so I think I certainly feel enthusiasm and joy and encourage people to try it. At the same time, I don't want to mislead people, and I think sometimes it's tempting to say that this is the easiest thing in the world, or that there aren't going to be challenges that come up, and that's just not true. You will face challenges. You will be in certain settings where you're not going to be able to order your favorite thing off of the menu. You will face situations where you have to explain to someone that you need to there needs to be a plant-based option, and for some people, I'm not this person because I'm confrontational by nature, or comfortable with confrontation, I should say. But for some people who are uncomfortable with confrontation or they're shy, this can be challenging. And I've seen this play out in restaurants where I'm with friends who they want something, but they are a little uncomfortable speaking up for themselves. And so I think that plays out in trying to let people know that, look, I want this meal to be plant based. Can we make some edit? And this comes up at family occasions all the time. Holidays. There's already a lot of stress around holidays and family, and now we're entering into making sure that there's the right food available. So this is why having some flexibility can be useful, because maybe it's not worth having a fight or an argument over the 0.01%. Or maybe someone says, okay, I'm eating 250 pounds of meat. I'm open to cutting back 50 pounds. Whenever I go out, I'm not going to order meat. But if I'm eating at home, I'm okay with eating meat, or the opposite. So I think, the flexibility for some people can decrease the negative feelings that are associated with this. I will also say the more you eat plant-based food, the harder it is to disassociate from the problem. So you'll go out to eat, you'll order a plant-based meal, 9 other people will order hot dogs and chicken wings and a steak, and you'll know that came from an animal who was tortured, that resulted in the degradation of the planet, that it's not good for people's health. It's hard to just stare at the truth. And so I think for a lot of people, they start on this journey and then they discover a lot more than they realized about our food system, about the world around us. But it's worth the challenges for the benefits. And it's worth not just the benefits for the person making those choices, but for those who are positively impacted by those choices.
How do societal and cultural norms lead you to advocate for reducing one's meat intake rather than outright immediately abolishing it?
People really like eating meat. It's one of the first things people do when they get more money. You look at low income countries, they're industrialized, there's more economic activity, they start eating more meat. And that's why in low income countries, we're seeing more and more consumers eat more and more meat, and increasingly that meat will come from factory farms. There are all sorts of reasons why people eat as much meat as they do. It's can be inexpensive, it tastes delicious to many people, and it's convenient. It's everywhere. And there's all sorts of cultural associations with it. For me, I think about going to my aunt's house and there being turkey on the table every year and what that was like. And I didn't spend that much time with my family, and that was a moment where we did. Or going to a baseball game with my dad. And similarly, I can count on the number on my hand, the number of times that happened and how special that was. And the opportunity to have a hot dog or have nachos and cheese, or the things that you eat when you go to baseball games, has some emotional connection to that. So there's there's a fear. There's all sorts of fears for people. What if I'm not going to be healthy? What if I need those nutrients? There's misinformation. There's disinformation. These meat producers actively spread lies about the ways that they raise animals for foods and their harm, and uh, the idea that people are protein deficient when they're not. Uh, and so there's so many reasons why people eat as much meat as they do. And I have found in life that when someone says to me, make your life really hard, give up everything that you love, um, have conflict with the people around you. That's not a recipe for success. And I think that's what a lot of people hear when someone tells them to go vegan. I know that's not what the communicator intends, but they're speaking to someone else that's not them and they're hearing it differently. And so I think it's a much softer landing to tell someone, hey, have you considered cutting back on animal products? I would feel this way about myself. If you told me, why don't you bulk up, go to the gym 7 days a week, go to the gym 5 days a week, it sounds really stressful to me. And I can't imagine it. Okay, would you consider doing 10 push ups? I mean, right now, stop talking and just do 10 push ups. I could do that. And if it feels good, it might lead me to think, okay, maybe I should do 11 push ups tomorrow or 20 push ups or so on. So this is not specific to food, it's specific to humans and how the vast majority of people operate. On a societal level, it's also worth acknowledging that it's really hard to get everyone to cut back on animal products. It's hard to get everyone to go vegan, of course. So, what can we do? And there are lots of different reducitarian type strategies at a societal level that I think are also important. So, for example, we can try to make plants the default option at hospitals and schools where people will receive plant based meals automatically, but they can opt out. They can choose the meat meal if they want. Or we can try to create alternatives like Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods to mimic the taste and texture and the experience of eating meat to make it easier for folks to have that trade off. So it's interesting when I get asked this question because I don't see a world where tomorrow everyone is vegan. So no matter what you're saying, whether go vegan or cut back on animal products, philosophically, to me, you are in search of a reducitarian kind of world. The only way to get what you want, if you're vegan, is to slowly cut back on animal products. And here's the bad news: we are headed in the other direction. So, not only are we not succeeding from a reducitarian perspective, we are experiencing the increasitarian experience where people are eating more and more meat every day. So, for anyone who is in search of a vegan world and is not happy with reducitarian kind of messaging, they really need to look at the direction we're going. We started this discussion speaking about utopias. I told you that we're at a 2 in terms of we're on hell on earth, very close to it. But every day we go from 2 to 1.99999 to 1.98. We are headed in the wrong direction. So I would be very excited if tomorrow I woke up and the world was still hell on earth, but just marginally better. People need to have realistic expectations. Otherwise, they're going to be very disappointed. Unfortunately, that's the nature of humanity. And I hope that we can lessen that suffering and move the needle as much as possible.
I've certainly seen a shift societally. Over the last 15 years, I've seen a lot of people who are much more open to eating vegan food. Saying that I'm vegan these days does not get the same looks of confusion or horror that it did back in 2009. As someone so invested in changing the future of our food system, how do you see the future of food?
It's a tough question because what I want to say is that we are headed toward people eating more plant-based food. We're headed toward a world where people are cutting back on animal products. We're headed toward a world where people are eating more Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods. We're headed toward a world where people are eating more cell-cultivated meat, or the idea that you can take a cell from an animal and place that cell in a nutrient-dense environment and it'll multiply and eventually become meat, real nature identical meat without the animal. And I think all of those goals are worthy of pursuing. And I think there is hope. It is possible that what I want to happen, what I just described, will happen. But I also think it's possible and maybe likely that that world will not happen, that we will continue to see people eat more and more meat, that we will continue to see the number of factory farms grow, not just on Earth, but on other planets, if we're thinking maybe 50 years out, 100 years out? Part of the challenge with the question is it really depends on the timeline. The longer we go out, the harder it is for me to know what the future is going to be. And I look at any technology and I see pros and cons. I'll give you one example that will not be popular, but that's okay. I'm very excited about cell cultivated meat. I think that really is an exciting technological development that people can eat the same meat that they want, but they don't have to degrade the environment or torture animals. The average person I meet um, is enthusiastic about that. Now, that's part of my circles. If you look at surveys, you can get upwards of 2/3 of people who don't want to eat cell cultivated meat, but that can change in a positive direction. I spoke with an investor recently who's very excited about cell cultivated meat because he thinks that people won't want to go to other planets unless there's meat available to them. And he's a space tech investor, and he really wants us to colonize other planets. And so part of his motivation for investing in cell cultivated meat is to create that world where we colonize other planets. And so you see my point in bringing this up. It's really difficult to know what some act or what some technology, the positive and negative impacts on the world, and whether it'll be net good. And it's hard to know what the future is going to be. And so I don't know is the answer. I really don't know. I know that I have to try every day to use evidence and reason, knowing I'm flawed, knowing I'm going to misinterpret and make mistakes to try to create the best world possible. But I think it's not intellectually honest to be optimistic, quite frankly. I think having hope is sensible because there's a chance. And I think saying you don't know is reasonable. But there's just a lot of evidence to suggest that in some ways we're headed in the negative direction. And I think for some reason it's unpopular to say that. I think people want me and others to say that everything's going to be okay because I think that feels good and it can be something that sort of squashes some of the anxieties and worries that we have. But I'm committed to being intellectually honest, and I believe that truth is a resource of its own that can create the world that we want to see. And so I think we need to be honest about the fact that we just don't know. And I'll just add, I do think it's exciting that we have some of these developments where it's gone easier for you to say that you're vegan, or it's gone easier for us to access vegan food. But you have to remember, my ultimate goal is not for you to feel comfortable saying that you're vegan. And my ultimate goal is not for us to access vegan food. It's to reduce suffering. And I can tell you from my perspective, suffering has increased since I've been working on this issue for the past 10 years. So we have to somehow hold these two truths in our mind that can be uncomfortable. In some ways, things are progressing in good ways, in positive ways. And at the same time, we're seeing negative trends that should be upsetting to people who care about making the world a better place. And it's very uncertain what the future is going to be. And all of those things are true. And no matter how uncomfortable that might make people feel, I think that's worth sharing and being honest about. And I think my hope is that that's not demotivating. It doesn't mean that we should stop. It means that we should be ever more motivated to try to make the world a better place. And also, it's worth recognizing that the sadness that you might feel at times in seeing the world the way that it is completely rational. It's not something that should be eradicated. That sadness is an outgrowth of compassion. I wish more people felt a little sad about the state of the world, because then we wouldn't have the state of the world that we have. So I'm pretty outspoken about sort of positive and toxic positivity. And I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the folks that sometimes feel angry or sad about the state of the world, and don't feel positive or optimistic all the time.
I love that. What would be the opposite of toxic positivity? And where do you think we should be on that spectrum?
Doomerism. Doomerism is doomerism is well, maybe not opposite is the right word, but that would be the other end of the spectrum that's bad. On the one hand, we have everything's going to be fine. On the other hand, we have everything's effed. That's not accurate either. I think we should be hopeful, is the word I like. Hope means that there is a chance that we can make the world a better place. That is undeniably true. No one can take that away from you or from me or to anyone listening. And to me, that's intellectually honest. I don't think we need to be anything but hopeful in order to proceed with trying to make the world a better place.
I like that you think we should be hopeful. Sounds to me like maybe that's about 40% along that spectrum. And maybe that's a good place to be in order for us to have the right mindset to do as much as we can within reason.
I like to think so.
I'm sure your palatable approach has been appreciated and embraced by many vegan curious folks. Do you have any success stories that you'd like to share?
My favorite success story is none other than my beautiful and loving and wonderful father, who I feel even more appreciation for now that I'm a dad, because I realize how difficult it is to be a parent. My dad is very much the typical American. He still eats way too many animal products, but a couple of years ago, he decided that he was going to cut back on animal products. Not persuaded by climate change, doesn't think that that's a concern or one that humans have caused. Not persuaded by animal issues, thinks it's reasonably important, but thinks it's pretty silly to care about a chicken when there are other important priorities at play here. But does care about his health and doesn't want to die at 59 like his father did, and I certainly don't want that, and wants to be healthy, and so decided to incorporate more plant-based foods in his diet. Once in a while, he'll call me. There's this place in Staten Island near where he lives. It's a juice bar type place, and he'll tell me, "Brian, I got that kale smoothie," and I'm so happy for him, and I'm so happy that he's made that change for himself, and that there are indirect benefits from that. He feels happier, he feels clearer, he lost some weight, and maybe even feels a little more connected to me in terms of understanding who his son is and the decision that I've made to focus on this issue, and him choosing to express what I think is important makes me really happy, and I'm so happy that he thinks it's important too. So again, not vegan or vegetarian or flexitarian by any stretch, but has incorporated significantly more plant-based foods into his diet. And if everyone did that, the world would be a significantly better place. And if my dad can do it, trust me, anyone can. And for those of you who'd like to meet my dad, you can watch the documentary Meet Me Halfway, and you can see his journey as he thinks about some of these issues related to meat consumption.
So, Brian, for listeners out there who may be vegan curious but would rather dip their toes in, what recommendations would you have for them?
Yeah, let's start with the person who wants to cut back on animal products. The first thing is get into the mindset that it's not all or nothing. So to celebrate every single plant-based meal you have and not worry too much about any kind of digressions from that. Eat the foods that you love, but swap in plant-based ingredients. So I really recommend people keep things simple. If you like burritos, I strongly encourage you to keep eating burritos. Just say the word guacamole instead of chicken, or add guacamole instead of chicken, or add tofu if you'd like. If you like spaghetti and meatballs like I did, just make it spaghetti primavera. Have that, some vegetables in there. If you like Thai food or Indian food, you can keep having the curries. Just make them plant-based instead. So it's part of it is just calming the mind around this is not going to necessarily be that you're going to buy an apron, you're going to get a hat, and you're going to make these very complicated cauliflower steaks, and that's the only way to eat. No, you can keep it really simple. That's really important. I like some structure. Maybe every Monday you commit Meatless Monday, or maybe you're going to say, weekday vegetarianism might be good for me. Monday through Friday, I'm not going to eat anything with a face. The weekend, it's entirely my choice. You can try Mark Bittman's approach of vegan before 6. So breakfast and lunch, you'll have plant-based meals, and for dinner, you can have whatever you want. Maybe you make a rule in the house, I'm going to have meat but not out, or vice versa. So having some kind of structure can be helpful. I do think, though, while what you put in your mouth is very important, what's even more important is what comes out of it. I don't want you to be a private reducetarian. I want you to bring as many people along for the journey so you can tell people that you're doing this thing, you're eating more plant-based meals. And yeah, it can be challenging at times, but overall it feels really great and you're really enjoying it. And you can go to your family's house and bring over a vegan meal. You can take your friends to a delicious plant-based restaurant. There are ways to bring people along for the journey that are not trying to force people or preach to people, just trying to share your experience with others in the most kind and compassionate and genuine way possible. And I just want to emphasize again that I'm a consequentialist. So the reasons I care about this are because I think it's going to create the most kind and wonderful world possible. It's not that I think any of these things are intrinsically good. I genuinely believe that by focusing on celebrating your successes instead of your failures, or by being kind, it will lead to a world that has less suffering in it. And that's what's important to me. And regardless of your philosophical worldview, my hunch is that you also think suffering is bad and happiness is good. So that's how I think about how we can try to encourage ourselves to cut back on animal products and also enter into a space where we're going to communicate effectively, not judgmental, not preachy, just showing up, planting seeds, and letting people decide what's important to them. And I'll add one last thing. In my 20s, I finally went to therapy. I shouldn't say finally because that's kind of early. A lot of people go to therapies in their 30s or 40s, so maybe in some ways I was ahead of the game. Why don't my parents do exactly what I want them to do? Why aren't people doing exactly what I want? Is a question a lot of people find themselves in one way or another asking in therapy. And the thing that you learn through that process is that you can't force people to do what you want. That is a difficult but entirely true realization. And I find that no matter where I am in life or what I'm trying to communicate, as long as I remind myself I can't force people, all I can do is plant seeds, and I have to allow them to make the decision for themselves because that's the only way people make decisions. No one gets forced to do things. Not really. You have to allow people to make their own decisions. I find that as long as I enter with that attitude, I never go wrong in terms of being as effective as possible and getting people to do what I want, which in this case might include cutting back on animal products. Anyone who's interested in learning more can visit the Reducetarian Foundation at reducetarian.org. They can also check out our documentary, Meet Me Halfway, MEAT, meetmehalfway.org. They can come to our Reducetarian Summit. We have an annual conference that takes place each year. This year, we're going to be in Dallas, Texas, October 25th to the 27th. They can take our pledge to cut back on animal products on our website. And we have lots of resources there as well for anyone who's interested in sharing the idea of cutting back on animal products with folks, or even becoming a part of the movement. That might mean considering starting a plant-based restaurant in your town, or trying to get a plant-based option on some restaurant in your community, or going to law school and suing a factory farm, or trying to become a philanthropist, become wealthy and donate money to effective charities. There are so many ways to contribute to the cause of ending factory farming, and we have lots of information on that on our website. And I'll add one more thing. Anyone is welcome to reach out to me directly at brian@reducetarian.org. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Wow, Brian, those are great recommendations. Thanks so much for taking the time to chat with me today. I really appreciate it. Every conversation goes a long way.
Thanks so much for having me.
I appreciated Brian's candid pragmatism and willingness to walk his own path. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you felt like this conversation was meaningful, please share with your friends and family. Also, please like, share, and subscribe to listen to future episodes.